Hi, my name is Dr. John Olson, and I was the Exploration Transition Manager in the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate at NASA headquarters. And I first became associated with the transition and retirement activity prior to my official capacity while I served as the Manager of International Space Station Operations in the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance at NASA headquarters. Started that in June of 2004, but my first official capacity in transition was as that Exploration Transition Manager with ESMD, and that started in the very early start of, I think, January 2006. The goal of the exploration, transition, and retirement activity was actually twofold. There was the retirement aspect, which was to retire the space shuttle and bring this program through a safe flyout to an efficient retirement. But my part of it, the part that I led, but it was truly a collaborative effort and both were seamless, was the transition to the next activity, meaning the future of human spaceflight exploration. And that was at first the Constellation program, so to create a seamless transition between Shuttle to Constellation, and ultimately with the follow-on cancellation of Constellation, it was the transition into the next program, which turned out to be the Space Launch System and the Orion Multipurpose Crew Vehicle. But to give you some semblance or some kind of understanding of the scope of this, it involved a tremendous amount of people. It was certainly one of the largest federal agency transitions in history, with 18,000 civil servants and over 100,000 contractors. So from a people perspective, it was huge. From a property perspective, with over 1 million line items of equipment, and that's specific line items, you could have perhaps as many as a couple to 100,000 equipment items within each line item. So it's just a phenomenal amount of people, property, both real and real property and personal property, countless facilities and infrastructure elements. Plus, these were not only government entities, but also throughout the contractors and sites across the globe. So from a people, property, infrastructure, facilities perspective, the scope was absolutely unprecedented and just truly profound. In fact, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, labeled Shuttle Transition and Retirement as number 13 of the top 15 challenges facing the entire country. So that kind of puts it in context and perspective. So this was truly a huge dual-pronged or dual-objective effort, planned and executed over almost a decade. From a perspective of the broad effort with shuttle transition and retirement, essentially there were several different layers or levels of stakeholders. At its base plane, we had the programs. Clearly, the Space Shuttle program, which had been around for 3 decades and had built up and was the anchor of human spaceflight. All the program elements, not only the government, but the contractors across the operations centers, supporting capabilities at the research centers, and even at the science centers as well, which had been a part of that rich history, were all a key part. On the other level, you had the International Space Station Program Office, and then transitioning to was the Constellation Program Office. So those 3 anchor program offices, plus pretty much all 10 centers, plus a huge amount of contractor and industry, both prime and sub-tier suppliers, were engaged. But that's just at the first layer to first order. So when we start talking about the second order organizations that included so many different federal departments and agencies like the Office of Personnel Management, the Department of Labor, the General Services Administration, the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Standards, and the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and so many other groups, including federal, state, and local entities. And then when you look at the international aspects, with the transatlantic abort sites, we had several countries involved. And so this truly became not only a multi-level activity. It became one that was vertically, programmatically, functionally, and institutionally quite a challenging, complex endeavor. Another important layer, another important element to discuss related to transition and retirement is the entire cross-agency effort. And so when we talk the Office of the Chief Engineer, when we talk the Office of Human Capital, the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance, when we talk our History Office, and so many others, whether they be mission support offices or whether they be the mission directorates themselves or the centers and in each of their functions. So in looking at that broad level of players, we had to work in broad unison. This was clearly an effort where we'd bring the unique functional competencies and the best and brightest from each of those groups together on a cohesive plan, an integrated plan, and have them each execute their component or their portion of this broader challenge. Additionally, I think it's also important to characterize. We've talked about the functions, we've talked about the programs, we talked about the entities, but I think as you talk about the general people dynamics, the cultural aspects of this, with Shuttle occupying its historic and prominent place in history, this was also a cultural phenomenon for the country, one with deep feelings, deep emotions, one which we're all very proud of, but yet at the same time, when we look at the risks and challenges associated with flying out and completing assembly of the International Space Station, flying out Shuttle, equipping it with the logistics and the capabilities necessary to effectively utilize station upon assembly complete, plus the fact that we were trying to preserve 50-plus years of U.S. leadership in human spaceflight, bridge a gap in so doing, which was inevitable based upon the realities of the funding that didn't come in time to fully close that gap. So in dealing with those challenges, which were really structural, and trying to preserve this U.S. leadership and advance human spaceflight exploration and operations through the next phase into the 21st century with Constellation and ultimately the follow-on programs that came after it, it was truly a colossal and phenomenal effort, and that can't be understated. But at the same time, the approach in dealing with that, which we'll talk about shortly, is the key. So in order to tackle this colossal problem that we've described, or really it's a challenge in terms of an effective and smooth and affordable and timely and efficient transition from the space shuttle to the follow-on program, it's really a large systems engineering problem. And I would even go further. I'd call it a systems of systems engineering challenge. And of course, that requires and necessitates a rigorous systems engineering breakdown and methodical approach to tackling it. With the scope of the problem being so large, any other approach seemed daunting and relatively ineffective. And so, of course, my PhD is in systems engineering and engineering, so this was a logical framework or reference plane from which to attack it. But I think as we looked as we looked at our leadership approach to it, we took the overall program and we said, what objective were we trying to achieve here? Well, we already talked about those first two objectives, breaking it down into the retirement aspect and then breaking it down into the transition aspect and saying, well, retirement, we want to minimize the amount of money that we're spending. We want to preserve safety in the flyout. We want to reduce the risks associated to that endeavor while efficiently lining all this up. On the flip side, on the transition side, we had to prudently look at what are we going to need? What do we know for sure we're going to need? What do we think we may? And what do we know we aren't going to need? And then go about the disposition of that and the transfer and time phasing the adoption of those into the new program elements which were just standing up. So not only was this a systems challenge, but it had temporal or phasing aspects to it as well. So in the broad setup, we broke it down with a functional work breakdown structure, just like you do any program activity. And we did treat this as a large program. And so in assigning the various elements and leadership elements and breaking it down in successively smaller, more manageable aspects, that's the way that we tackled this. And I think in retrospect, that led us to a methodical, rigorous approach that let it be consumed or tackled in bite-sized, manageable portions, ones that actually we could easily communicate, or we could easily engage various elements of the agency or other agencies or industry or academia upon, and it was not only understandable, but it was manageable and executable. And I think the key to the whole effort was integrating that in a way that was hands-on enough to make it effective, but flexible enough to make it adaptable to a constantly dynamic political, economic, programmatic, and functional environment. So that gave us both the flex and the rigor that we needed. The key to integrating this entire complex, multifaceted activity was really communication. And by communication, I mean communication in every single sense of the word. We're talking about communication of risk, because we managed by risk. What are the challenges? How do we mitigate those? How do we eliminate them? How do we ameliorate the situation? How do we put funding or people or resources on those commensurate with the level of risk? But at so many other levels, it was about communication of what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, so that we could get people on board and engaged and involved, and not just being directed, but rather owning this challenge and this opportunity. And as we mentioned earlier, you know, there was a huge emotional aspect and a huge cultural and element to this, such that people inherently understood what we were doing and the gravity of the situation. So by knowing what was being asked or what the plan was on the short, mid, and long range scales, they were able to better participate. So let's talk a little bit and break down what our communication approach was. Simply, and I think this is a universal truism, our policy with both Joel Kearns and I, as the co-leads of this activity, was tell them what we know, what we don't know, and how we're getting to how we're working towards learning what we don't know, and then communicate it. So again, what we know, what we don't know, and how we're working towards getting those things that are yet to be resolved, yet to be refined, or yet to be resolved. And so we did that in a broad strategy. Certainly, talking up and out was fundamentally important, and this was to the White House, this was to Congress, this was to all those agencies that we discussed, across our own agencies, across 10 centers in our workforce, which is absolutely key, to industry, working constantly with industry groups, trade groups, and professional societies and organizations. That was fundamentally important. Likewise, we had to manage this complex systems engineering approach with our programs and our mission support agencies and our mission support organizations, rather, and the centers. And we did that through a two-pronged approach. We had what's called transition control boards, or TCBs, and those dealt with the tactical or the nearer-term decisions and the nearer-term informational briefs that were necessary. Likewise, on a longer-term strategic level, or a little higher plane, or a longer timeline for the decision, or for those acquisition type strategic dialogues, we had the strategic control boards. And so we had the transition control boards, the TCB, and then we had the strategic control boards. And so we used those we used those as very effective tools to bring all the various and relevant groups into a single consolidated place. We used the Space Operations Center to host those meetings and also broadcast those through video teleconference, and we had detailed meeting summaries and notes, and so I think that ties me to the next communication element, which was really about knowledge capture and transfer. This is, as we mentioned, a 30-year program, and we were trying to not only make sure we had rigorous approaches to managing current information, but also properly archiving and recording with consistent with the federal laws and requirements and historical requirements for the state and federal government. So we used every tool underneath the sun. We used traditional mechanisms like PowerPoint and Word to capture things. We also used social media, wikis, and we used our ICE, Integrated Collaborative Environment, a digital repository that everybody from centers to contractors to civil servants could both access and put things towards and archive. We likewise used a variety of newsletters. We used regular communications. We spoke and did public speaking events regularly. We spoke not only in large groups, but small groups, tailored employee groups to the union and to so many different constituents and stakeholders that I think by having such a constant and pervasive and consistent level of communication that used all those modalities plus all the existing constructs and the new ones that we added in order to amp up this specific communication. We again tackled that, tell them what you know, tell them what you don't know, and how you're working to get that. And as long as you're honest and absolutely open and timely, I think people gained a higher level of confidence and really comfortability with this overall colossal activity, and that can't be underestimated, because people are inherently uncomfortable with change, and this helped us deal with this change. And so as a change management strategy, as an organizational approach to really communicating the fact that we were going to a bright future. We were celebrating the huge accomplishments, but we were doing this in a systematic and smart and prudent and affordable way. All of our big stakeholders became comfortable with this approach, and frankly, it really muted or eliminated a lot of criticisms or a lot of unwarranted negative press or negative challenges, because people really responded, hey, they're telling us they're doing the best, they're telling us in a timely fashion, and they actually have a plan for when they don't know something or going about to get it. And we know because they've been following this over the course of months and years that they're going to follow through, and so we built up a credibility with all those stakeholders that really helped drive home the effectiveness of this overall effort through communication. One of the real tough challenges, we've talked about the obvious ones in terms of the people, the property, the risks, the cultural, but we were really, in essence, executing the safe flyout of the Space Shuttle program while we're assembling the International Space Station, and at the same time trying to rapidly build up development of the Constellation program. And that necessitated some really tough, oftentimes very impassioned dialogues and discussions about how and when do we transfer things. When, Constellation had an insatiable desire to get things right away and right now, but at the same time, oftentimes they didn't have the organizational or structural phasing set up to fully receive them, whether it be the facilities or the point in the program. And of course, we had identified a nice, rigorous plan, phased and built out. But when you got to that point, one of the really tough challenges for the shuttle program in terms of flyout was, as we made many of these decisions, they were irrevocable decisions, meaning as we turned off a sub-tier supplier or a major component, that was a fundamental point of no return. And so we had not one, not hundreds, but thousands of those types of decisions. And whether that be facilities, whether we said we no longer need that facility, we can release it, or whether it's a supplier, or whether it's a part or a component that gets transferred to the new program that then gets modified, or whether that be people, as we looked at rolling people off, whether they be civil servants or contractors, as part of the prudent phase down and effort to save money, because we didn't want to have a huge standing army, nor could we afford a large group of folks. Those kind of decisions for any program manager are excruciatingly challenging to make, particularly given the dynamics of human spaceflight. And what's the last thing that you want to do is make the wrong decision and not be able to go back. But I think we managed that very well, and I applaud the strength, the courage, and actually the homework that so many people did to contribute to smart, risk-informed, and knowledge-based decision-making. And that was the key. Likewise, on the acceptance side, the program management team really had to lean forward, and we had to develop trust between the two communities, such that there would be handoffs and budget quid pro quos. So, I'll cover this, you cover that. And so that occurred between not only the programs but also the mission directorates, as well as between and among the centers, as each postured to handle the requirements of the new programs and build up, while at the same time we of course didn't want to have an over build up or an over retention of goods such that we'd never have the funds to effectively disposition so many items. And that carries a huge overhead cost with it that under the current and future fiscal climate isn't possible or viable. So I think what I'd like to also focus on is, from a budgetary perspective, one thing that we did not do is we held off on and we were regularly asked, what's this going to cost? We were asked by some very major and influential stakeholders, particularly Congress, what's the cost of shuttle transition and retirement? And we did not deliver a specific number early on. Why? Because we didn't have enough insight and understanding into the scope of the actual effort until we did the systems engineering breakdown, until we did the studies and the economic analysis and the parametric cost assessments that we did do at the start. Turned out to be, as we refined those with pilot projects and prototypes and real data, as we refined those, they all refined much further down. So what might have been at the onset in 2004 of a $3 or $4 billion a guesstimate or grand wag or estimate, had we taken that at face value right then and there, we would have never, we would have been very far from the mark, and we would have never driven greater efficiencies. But instead, each year, we refined that down further and further, and it went down to $2 billion, down to $1 billion, ultimately ending up in the several hundreds of millions of dollar realm. But systematically, that approach, that refinement, helped us to preserve those funds for doing other mission activities in the agency and building up, rather than spending them on what would have been an overestimate to begin with. But I think the key is that ties back to that communication aspect. By communicating why we were doing that and showing physically and demonstrably how we were making progress each year and drilling that down and refining it, and delivering, the workforce reports to Congress and the cost estimates and things of that sort to all these various groups. Well, they then had credibility, and they actually went along with us. So it's this this quid pro and this relationship building that's so fundamental. Well, one of the profound challenges that came as a bit of a surprise on the tail of this huge shuttle transition and retirement activity was the news in January of 2010 that the president had decided to cancel the Constellation program. And so here I had been as the exploration transition manager, focused on the efficient and effective stand-up and transfer of people, property, and resources, and everything that it would take to build the Constellation program from the necessary elements of the Space Shuttle program. And we received this news, and so personally, that was perhaps one of the most challenging professional challenges I've ever had to deal with, because it was such a paradigm shift of going from a build mentality whereas at the absolute epicenter of this huge systems engineering approach in planning and orchestrating this very complex activity to, hey, with that knowledge, you now have the challenge to, within 3 weeks, put together a Constellation cancellation and transition plan to cancel that program and preserve the human space flight critical components, people, skills, hardware, infrastructure necessary to do the next thing. And so I remember vividly, we got that news, and here in Washington, D.C., we had a thing called Snowmageddon. We got about 4 feet of snow, and for the first week of that 3-week period, all of government was closed. But with the absolute firm deadline to do that, what I did is I again adopted a rapid systems engineering approach to this, and I said, so what do we need to do? We need to come up with an effective plan that preserves the human spaceflight capability for this nation going forward. And you talk about another super challenge, that was it. But here, the timelines and the planning were hyper compressed. So what we did is we got Charlie Stegemuller, who was the program planning control person at that time for Constellation program. He became my deputy, and I got around 100 folks from all the functional disciplines, the ones we've talked about, from each of the programmatic elements, the organizations that had that expertise and competency in NASA headquarters and across the centers. And we put everybody together in a room, and we started working the problem. Again, we did that functional breakdown. We had taken all the lessons learned from the shuttle transition and retirement, which was still underway, and we readily adopted those to a plan. And no kidding, in 3 weeks we were able to deliver a plan. But I got to tell you, from a personal level, calling people immediately after the news had become public, and these people were the topmost leaders in each of their functional areas, and many were heavily engaged in Constellation program, calling them and asking them to lead the effort to build and construct this Constellation transition plan. You talk about one of the toughest things to do, but I can't emphasize enough the absolute professionalism, the absolute commitment, the absolute dedication, the absolute insight and sensitivity and emotional courage that all of them conveyed and brought to bear. It wasn't easy for any of us because of the scope of the challenge, because of the emotions, because of the environment. But we did it. We got it done, and I think the implementation of that led us to where we are today, in having preserved so many of the absolutely important elements while following and executing the new highest direction of the land. And so we embraced the task at hand, and I think it just speaks again. It's another shining example of, despite adversity, despite challenge, besides a a colossal and just super tough set of circumstances, the NASA team and the broader elements of our leadership came to focus on a task and get it done. And so I can't speak volumes of thanks and commendation and accolades for the people who are involved. But from a challenge perspective, this was round two, and it was very tough, and a lot of people were fatigued and still heavily engaged in the shuttle transition and retirement activity. So this double whammy was tough, but people stepped up, and I think it succeeded. In looking at all of this entire magnitude of the shuttle transition and retirement challenge, I'd offer three enduring principles, or the three most important elements that were key to the successful implementation and execution of this activity. First, you got to have a plan. A rigorous, well thought out, well researched, flexible plan is vitally important, and this plan has got to be a systems engineering approach. We've talked about that. It's got to be a risk-based plan. It's got to have a continuing level of fidelity and involvement, and it's got to be not only embraced, but it's got to be absolutely the driver behind everything you're doing. Number two, you got to have communication. Communication up, down, in and out, vertically, throughout the organization and all levels, leveraging all the tools available, traditional ones, new ones, non-traditional, and engaging all the stakeholders and having them be a part of the process from the very beginning to the very end, and telling people what you know, what you don't know, and how you're finding out what you don't know and getting there. I think that's fundamentally important. And I think the third thing, and perhaps the absolute most important thing of the three, is you got to have people. You got to have the best people you can engaged through that communication and through that plan, but you got to put trust and responsibility and hold your people accountable, and then they will just amaze you. As we talked about the challenges that the double challenges that we went through in the course of these transitions, it's absolutely phenomenal. People are truly NASA's and this nation's greatest resource, and I think by applying them through smart and effective leadership, the right amount of direction, the right amount of hands-on, the right amount of guidance and communication with an effective plan, there's nothing that we can't do, and I think this is evidence of that. So as we look forward, going forward, plan, communicate, and engage your people, and you're going to be in great shape. So thanks very much.